Emotions are a subject I address rather infrequently on the channel. While my decision to cover a topic is mainly informed by how emotionally resonant I personally find a piece of work, the way I cover them tends to be clinical and detached. Coupled with my general desire to discuss games with digestible narrative breakdowns, this typically leaves me in a position where I feel somewhat less than comfortable talking about games explicitly framed around emotional metaphors, rather than narrative. Emotions are powerful things, influencing not only ourselves but the people and places around us, for better or worse. Perhaps the reason I've avoided covering games of this type is due to an emotion of my own: fear. The fear that I, a deeply private person, would somehow expose an aspect of my personality by publicly interpreting these metaphors, and thus leave myself open to criticism of that interpretation. I suppose that fear is why I've decided to talk about today's game. It's a game about grief, or rather, a game about confronting and overcoming grief. Presented as a whimsical journey through a pastel watercolor fantasy world. A game where every aspect from visual design, music, mechanics, and gameplay are used to push one single idea: move forward, past grief. Today I'm here to talk about For the unfamiliar, Gris is the 2018 debut release, published by Devolver Digital, from Barcelona-based Nomada Studio, the brainchild of seasoned video game developers Adrian Cuvas, Roger Mendoza, and famed Spanish artist Conrad Rosset. Cuvas and Mendoza, two longtime friends and former Ubisoft employees, encountered Rosset at a Barcelona bar in 2016, after which the three set upon creating a development studio with focus on smaller, artistically driven games. That game is, of course, Gris, or gray in Spanish. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the entirety of Gris exists as a visual metaphor for overcoming the many stages of grief. As such, I felt that it's important to establish some naming conventions for the entities that exist in the world. First and foremost is our player avatar. Notice I didn't say protagonist, because for all intent and purposes, the world of Gris and everything within are representational facets of our protagonist. As such, I will refer to the player character as the child, short for inner child. Second is the adult female depicted in numerous effigies scattered across the world, which I will refer to as the woman. This unnamed woman serves as visual representation of the actual human being struggling through grief, who is slowly pieced back together as the child scours her shattered emotional landscape. Finally, the writhing, roiling, inky blackness of the game's, for lack of a better term, antagonist, sorrow. All-consuming and nearly ever-present, sorrow attempts to stop the child and consume the world at every opportunity. Now, with the stage set and our players in position, let's begin our journey. As mentioned earlier, every element of Gris serves as a metaphor, and appropriately, your first player action is to stand up. After the violent dissolution of the child's world, she's left voiceless in a near featureless void. It's only through the decision to stand up and move forward that the process of healing begins. After a few steps, the child discovers the blasted landscape still has life to offer. From here, the player is introduced to the core gameplay loop of Gris: traversal, platforming, puzzle solving, and the collection of stars. These stars act as progression keys, forming bridges which allow the child to progress through the game's stages. After a simple tutorial, we're introduced to the game's strongest visual motif, as the child reintroduces color to the world. It's here that Rosette's artistic sensibilities and role as creative director truly shine, and the effect is stunning. Slowly enrobing the world with layer after layer of ethereal watercolor. While the use of color to delineate one's emotional state isn't particularly original, Gris's execution of this effect is a stunning visual achievement. The child then discovers the single reoccurring landmark in the game, a partially raised temple, which I will refer to as the sanctuary. Upon entering the sanctuary, the child's stars flitter away into the sky, creating a permanent bridge to the heavens for the child to eventually ascend. The sanctuary also acts as a central hub, spoken off to various stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And this is where Gris's commitment to its central theme really shines. Just by arriving at the sanctuary, the child has already moved past denial. Let's rewind a bit. Back at the start of the game, after regaining the ability to run and jump, the child, in a literal act of denial, can attempt to return to a happier time by running to the left of the screen, only to be confronted with a weeping effigy of the woman, causing the child to once again collapse in despair. However, when left without player input, the child will stand up on her own, ready to move forward. Even within its introduction, Gris uses the medium of video games to hammer home its core ethos. Departing from the sanctuary, the child is presented with the second stage: anger. A blasted desert waste punctuated with violent sandstorms, which threaten to blow away the child, forcing her to take shelter within the numerous structures dotting the landscape. This is where another design decision comes into play. In any other game, being caught in the storm would most likely result in a game over. But that gameplay mechanic becomes antithetical to the central theme in Gris. The process of grief lacks a fail state, save for one: abandonment of the process. Thus, the only true game over in Gris is to stop playing. Eventually, using the structures as safe havens, the child happens upon an altar and is granted her first power: the ability to transform her cloak into a massive block, allowing her to venture into the storm's uncontrolled rage without fear. After which, the child discovers a temple with numerous effigies of the woman in anguish. It's here that the child is able to use her newfound ability and descend into the depths of the world. This descent serves as the introduction of sorrow, which occupies a rather interesting place in Gris. As mentioned earlier, sorrow is presented as the antagonistic element in Gris, but there are a few important details worth noting. First, sorrow is not the direct cause of grief in Gris, but rather an inevitable byproduct. Second, at the point of its introduction, it is presented as a kaleidoscope of benign black butterflies, which are only released once the child uses the coping mechanism of the block to descend into sorrow's realm at the bottom of the world. This act serves to illustrate the correlation between the onset of sorrow and the process of grief, illustrating the fact that coming to terms with one aspect isn't enough. From here, the child is returned to the world above, eventually ascending into the sky where she reintroduces green to the world. And in turn descends to the sanctuary whose once dead tree has returned to life, allowing access to the next stage. Bargaining is presented in a rather interesting way, both visually and mechanically. Bargaining is set within a lush, verdant forest of reds and greens, with square trees whose canopies vanish and reappear with a charming cloth-like animation. However, the bargaining aspect of the stage is only revealed with the introduction of this charming little fellow, who I'll call Brick, who, while initially suspect, begins to take a liking to the child as she progresses through the stage, using her block ability to knock loose apples from trees. This ultimately culminates with the child's separation and reunion with Brick, who presents her with a star. This serves as a subtle subversion of the bargaining stage, as the child attempts to negotiate away her pain through the care of another. However, this isn't Brick's journey, and after having its fill, can only provide the child with the means to move forward. This subversion comes with the revelation that Brick is in possession of the star, and thus paints the child's actions less as a means to an end and more genuine concern. This frames bargaining as a significantly less antagonistic and damaging stage than denial and anger before it, while still expressing the need to move on, which the child does after encountering her second altar and acquiring a new ability. Flight, or rather, a parody of it, allowing the child to double jump and slowly descend to Earth, or, when surrounded by red butterflies, launch herself into the sky in an attempt to reach the former heights she once occupied. Navigating through the Sky Temple, however, only serves to initiate a confrontation between her and Sorrow, which, in an apparent mockery of the child's personal growth, takes the form of a giant amorphous bird. In an attempt to bar the child from reaching the precipice of the temple, I do want to take a little time to once again draw attention to a fantastic bit of design work regarding Sorrow. While presented as huge and immensely powerful, Sorrow is at its core an empty void. Using her newfound abilities, the child is able to ultimately banish Sorrow, if only for a time. And ascend to the top of the temple. From here, the child rediscovers the color blue. And with it, we're treated to the revelation that her efforts have not only managed to return some semblance of balance to the world, but the woman as well, underscored by her nearly reconstructed effigy. Along with cool tones and hues, the recovery of blue has also brought with it water and rain. After descending to Earth, the child is returned to a significantly wetter and slightly more melancholy forest. Using both her double jump ability and the newly elevated water levels, the child is able to make her way back to the sanctuary, to deposit her stars and descend to the 4th stage. Depression. Located directly beneath the sanctuary, depression manifests appropriately as a damp, dark cave, and as such presents the player with a significantly more vertical level layout than the previous 3 stages. Here, the child descends ever deeper, until making her way to a flooded grotto with another altar, where she acquires her 3rd ability. Swim, allowing her to descend ever deeper into the depths of depression. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about the visual execution of depression. A commonly used metaphor for describing depression is an emotional sense of drowning, which is explicitly presented in the level design. The descent, however, is the important aspect I wish to focus on. As someone who struggled with depression for the majority of their life, I can attest to the slow, insidious fall into it. For me, depression has always manifested as an emotional gradient from relatively fine to overwhelming sadness. Nomada Studio's decision to illustrate this as an oceanic descent from clear waters teeming with life to an impassable inky abyss struck a powerful chord with me. Upon arriving at this impasse, the child is once again tasked with locating stars in order to awaken a massive illuminated sea tortoise, which then guides her through the darkness. Whereupon exiting, she is once again reunited with the now reconstructed effigy of the woman, who opens her eyes as the child rediscovers the color yellow. after which the child is prompted to sing. However, she has yet to regain her voice, and her inability to do so summons sorrow. Which promptly shatters the effigy and attempts to consume the child. Now, for some much-needed context. As you may have noticed, the stages of Gris have all shared the name of one of the 5 stages of grief, or the Kubler-Ross model, which postulates a series of emotions experienced by terminally ill patients and people who have lost loved ones. The model, named after Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a Swiss-American psychiatrist, first came to mainstream prominence in her 1969 book, On Death and Dying. It's a fairly well-known concept which has been explored across various media over the years. However, a widely held misconception is of a linear progression of the stages, as in they must be overcome in a specific order. This misconception became so prevalent that in her later years, Dr. Kubler-Ross lamented presenting the model in a way that was so easily misunderstood. Now, I gave you all of that backstory to illustrate how Gris acknowledges this misinterpretation without compromising the game's flow. So far, the child has progressed the stages one right after another, but here, with the reappearance of sorrow, the woman shatters, signaling an emotional regression, culminating with sorrow's transformation into a massive ill which literally chases the child back into the depths of depression. Thanks to the rediscovery of yellow, however, the child is able to navigate through the darkness on her own, before once again being assailed by sorrow, which almost succeeds in devouring her. Eventually, the child is able to make her way out of depression and return to the sanctuary. Where she is granted access to the final stage. Acceptance. Thanks to the reintroduction of yellow, the child is now able to access this final stage, a spectral memory of the sanctuary's former glory, manifested by the color's pale glow, which, when removed, causes the architecture to slowly fade out of existence. This design decision once again highlights the stage's central theme. The area, while solid, only exists as a comfortable memory, a memory the child becomes lost in due to the stage's secondary gravity flipping mechanic. And while that memory may be wonderful, one is forced to accept the fact that things will simply never be the same, and move forward. The art direction and level design, with its explicit use of the full spectrum of rediscovered colors and undisturbed architecture, create the most visually arresting area of the game. Once again, the child is tasked with locating stars to unlock her final ability. Sing. an ability that requires a little more scrutiny than the previous three, which allowed the child limited manipulation of the world. However, with the rediscovery of her voice, the child is now able to alter the world on a far greater scale. Which allows the child to restore her surrounding, escape the memory, and finally move on. Returning to the sanctuary, the child is able to finally complete her bridge. However, before she can ascend, she is once again confronted by sorrow. Having grown just as, if not more powerful than the child, and reveals itself as her dark mirror. With this revelation, sorrow literally devours the world, colors, and child. Here, within the belly of the beast, the child is forced to make a final stand. It's worth noting that in their previous encounters, when able, the child fled from sorrow. Through this inaction, say, avoidance, sorrow was able to so thoroughly entrench itself in the world that it eventually became powerful enough to consume everything. It's here, at the binary decision between hope and sorrow, that the child is forced to confront the entity with the only weapon she has left. Gris is a game about grief. A beautiful, hopeful, charming game about grief. A game that resonated with me in a way I didn't expect. The catalyst of grief comes in many forms. The road not taken, the opportunity squandered, the loss of friends and loved ones. Overcoming the pain of grief may seem insurmountable, but in truth, it's a journey that Nomada Studios expertly crafted into a stunning experience. An experience that treats subject matter with respect, while also hiding it in plain sight. Emotions are a subject I address infrequently on the channel. I am an intensely private person. Yet, as I played through Gris, I started to realize that I had my own grief to process. And the simple act of playing a simple game set me on my own path of confrontation. And that's a powerful thing. Gris may not be the most challenging or exciting game, but it's a game with a message and shows us that, given the right perspective, one can find beauty in sorrow and ultimately transform that sorrow into hope. And who can say there's no value in that?